In this video, I'll dive into everything you need to know about aperture by covering a whole range of mistakes you want to avoid. My name is Mads Peter Iversen. I make weekly videos about landscape photography where I take you out into the field and cover all the important topics that you need to know about when you do landscape photography. I also make videos in the studio where I dive deeper into specific topics. So it has been a while since I've made one of these fundamental videos on YouTube, and with an increased amount of comments that are asking about aperture, but also coming home from a couple of workshops where there were quite a lot of fundamental questions, I think it's about time that I do make one of these very fundamental videos about aperture. So the first big mistake is to not know what aperture actually is. So the aperture is the hole in your lens through which the light comes and hits the sensor. That hole can be opened up or closed down. Aperture, like shutter speed and ISO, determines how bright or dark your photo will become. However, unlike ISO, which only adjust the brightness of your photo, shutter speed and aperture is two of the exposure factors. They determine how much light actually hits the sensor. Aperture is measured in f numbers, and f numbers are actually fractions, which means that if you dial your camera to f4, it's actually f1/4. Dial it to f8, it's actually 1/8. f22, it's 1/22. Knowing this, it does make sense that as the number increases, the aperture closes down, exactly because the number is actually a fraction. So if you go from f4 through f8, f11 and f22, you're closing down the aperture, you're letting in less light, and the other way around. If you open up the aperture, go from, like, let's say f8 to f4, then you're letting in more light. So this was everything you need to know about aperture in regard to exposure. The more we open up the aperture, the more light we let onto the sensor, and the more we close down the aperture, the less light we let onto the sensor. However, aperture also have a secondary feature, or what we can call a creative feature. As you open up the aperture, you reduce the depth of field, which means that everything either in front of where you focus with your camera or behind of where you focus with your camera will be more out of focus. So when we close down the aperture, we expand the depth of field, so everything in front or behind of where you focus will be more in focus or less blurry. I will take a few photos of the tree right here in front of me with the mushrooms on, and you can see how, as I change the aperture, the background will come more and more in focus, because I am focusing on the mushrooms on the foreground trunk, and you can see how the trees in the background is becoming more and more and more sharp. Now you can use this effect in so many different ways. For portrait photography or wildlife photography, it's really beautiful to have that smooth out of focus background where you really can see and just look and focus on the subject in the scene. However, for landscape photography, we generally want to have the entire scene as much in focus as possible. Now, it is important for me to say that this is only a rule of thumb to have the entire landscape in focus. Generally, we want to do that when we are photographing vistas. However, in certain situations, you may want to have a shallower depth of field and either throw the foreground or the background a little bit or a lot out of focus. A recent example is this one from Tuscany, where I in one photo made an out of focus foreground. I think it adds to the ethereal feeling of the photo, and the foreground becomes less messy with an open aperture. Now, if you want to learn more about focus, be sure to check out my video about that subject. You can check it out up here in the corner. So now that we have established that we, as a rule of thumb, always want to have as much in focus when we do landscape photography as possible. So why don't we just shoot everything at f22 and be done with it? Well, that comes down to an optical phenomenon called diffraction. So the more you stop down your aperture, the more the light is scattered through that smaller and smaller hole. And that scattered light creates what you would call a softer image. The image quality simply just becomes softer. And as a rule of thumb, we obviously also want to have our photos to be sharp. Now, I have found over the years that generally with most lenses, almost all lenses, you want to just avoid the 3 most stopped down apertures. In most lenses, that would be f22, f20 and f18. But it is good to know how far up your apertures go, because in some longer lenses, telephoto lenses, you can actually go beyond f22, and sometimes f22 is sharp enough for you to have an acceptable image quality in your photos. So you will need to take it a little bit on lens by lens basis and depending on what focal length you're shooting at. Now, to open an aperture can also introduce sharpness reducing optical phenomena such as spherical and chromatic aberration, coma, anstagisms and curvature of field. All these optical phenomena you can reduce by closing down the aperture. So all this basically means that you generally do not want to close down your aperture too much because of diffraction and softness of the photo. However, on the other side of the spectrum, you don't want to open up your aperture completely because you can also experience their optically degrading phenomena. The world famous landscape photographer Ansel Adams once said that there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept, and I completely agree with him. Generally, when it comes to sharpness, it is much more important that you make sure that whatever you're taking a photo of is actually interesting to look at, and for that you need composition. If you want to learn much more about composition, be sure to get my 2 ebooks on exactly that topic. They're super easy to read as they have minimal text, and there are loads of examples to get to the point fast visually. In each of these ebooks I cover 9 different compositional tools, and in the last chapter I put it all together in different examples. There are links to both the full versions of the ebooks and the free light versions of these ebooks down in the description of this video. So another mistake you want to avoid that is aperture dependent is vignetting. Vignetting is the black or darker frame you can have out here on the edges of your photos or video for that matter. How much vignetting there is a combination of the specific lens you're using, what focal length you're using, and what aperture you're using. As a rule of thumb, if you close down your aperture, you reduce the vignetting. And generally, I prefer to reduce the optical vignetting from my lenses and then add a little bit vignetting in the post-processing. I want to be able to control the vignetting. Now, one thing I never hear other photographers here on YouTube talk about is that with the longer lenses, super zoom lenses and telephoto lenses, even though it's high quality lenses, you may in flatter scenes, let's say on foggy days or in big landscapes with a lot of sky, actually introduce circular vignettes in the middle of your frame. And these circular vignettes will become really visible if you start adding a lot of contrast, dehaze or clarity to your photos. Now, sadly, there's not really any way to get rid of these vignettes other than doing it manually with the brush in post-processing or maybe some radial filters. But I think it's important that you're aware that they can happen. You generally want to avoid them, and they do occur in the combination between what lens you're using, the aperture, and at what focal length you're shooting. So the question is, how do you avoid all these optical phenomena that will degrade your image quality? The best way is simply just to test your lenses. Right now I'm shooting with the Tamron 28 to 200 millimeter, and what I would do is simply just zoom all the way out to 28 millimeter And then I would start taking photos at f2.8, which is the most open aperture I can get with this lens. And then I will just gradually close down the aperture. When I reach f16, which is the most closed down aperture with this lens, I will simply just zoom in to 35mm and repeat the process. And after that, 50mm, 70mm, 100, 135, and then 200mm. In that way, I test all apertures and all the main focal lengths all the way throughout the lens. And in that way, I can very easily get an idea about how severe the chromatic aberration, the fringing, and generally the image quality is at both the center of the frame and in the corners of the frame at all the different focal lengths of the specific lens. If image quality and sharpness is something that means a lot to you, then you may want to consider shooting at a more open aperture, let's say at f8, and then do something that's called focus stacking. Focus stacking simply means that you're changing the plane of focus in different exposures. So you take one exposure where this part is in focus, and then the next exposure where something behind it is in focus, and further behind and further behind and further behind, and then you combine those photos in image software. Now, it is a creative and technical decision up to yourself whether you want to deal with focus stacking in post-processing, or you just want to sacrifice a tiny bit of sharpness for the sake of getting the entire photo in focus. And speaking of more open apertures and mistakes to avoid, is to paying too much for a lens with some features that you may not need. That is why I generally recommend for landscape photography that you just go with f4 lenses instead of their corresponding f2.8 lenses. Generally, the f4 lenses are just as sharp. They may even be smaller and lighter, which is great. And you don't really need the f2 over the f4 because we're going to close down the aperture anyway. And it may also come at a quite reduced price compared to the f2.8. Now, if you're going to do astro landscape photography, I would recommend to get a fast prime rather than a fast zoom, because the fast prime usually can open up the aperture much more than even an f2.8 zoom lens. So this here is a 20mm f1.8 lens, and you can even get wide angle lenses that go down to f1.4. And obviously that lets in much more light than f2.8. Now, when it comes to aperture, there are a lot of creative decisions to make. And one of them is simply just to not just take the consequences of yourself being in a scene where it's necessary to shoot at f22. In this specific example here, I was sitting in a small waterfall. It was raining, it was windy. I was almost sliding down the rocks here in the front, and I really needed to get both the waterfall and the background town and background mountains in focus. However, it was just next to nearly impossible to take two photos at, like, let's say f11 to get an optimal aperture in regard to sharpness. So I decided to simply just stop down to f22, wipe off the front element of my lens, and then be fast to take the photo before more spray hit the lens. It was quite the uncomfortable situation to sit in, and in that particular circumstance it did make sense to shoot at f22 and compromise on sharpness. However, I do generally try to avoid f22, and in most circumstances where I'm not in an extreme situation like that, I would probably stop down to f8 or f11 and, if need be, focus stack the photo. If you want to learn how to focus stack your photos, how to blend your photos, and much more, be sure to enroll in my big post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. In this course, I basically cover all the different techniques that I use for editing my photos, everything from the most basic all the way through to the more advanced techniques such as blending and editing with luminosity masks, blending different exposures together seamlessly, even making composites if you're into that, but also how to edit black and white photos, working with light trails and ambient light, editing really moody photos, and beautiful golden hour photos. There is a coupon code so you can get a little bit off, and a link down in the description of this video. Now this part here is not so much a mistake, it's more like a creative decision you definitely need to take into consideration, and that's regarding sun stars. Sun stars happen when you shoot into the sun at a closed down aperture, something like f/16, even f/22, and you get these spikes on the sun, and you can even further enlarge these spikes if you have the sun very clear in the sky but halfway interrupted by some kind of object like a cliff, a lighthouse, or so forth. Now what you need to ask yourself is wherever this sun star takes attention away from your main subject. So in these two examples here from the Faroe Islands, one photo with a sun star and one without. I could have edited the photo without with a sun star. However, I felt, and as you can also see here, that the sun star is taking too much attention away from this beautiful sea stack arch. And therefore I decided to not make a sun star in the right-hand photo. Now in this photo here from Mesa Arch, I decided to use the sun star because it's a great focal point as the arch takes up a large part of the photo, so your eye can always wander back to the sun star photo, the sun coming up. And since the sun is interacting with Mesa Arch by throwing its morning light onto the cliff that is reflected up on the underside of the arch, it makes sense to also have the sun in there as a subject. And in this example here with the wild garlic in a forest, I also used the sun as a little spike up there in the canopy as the focal point in the shot from where you can explore the scene. And also, since the sun is throwing its light onto the scene in this dappled way where parts of the flowers are being lit, it also for me made sense because again the sun star is interacting with the scene in front of you. So it's not right or wrong to include a sun star in your landscape photos, you just need to take into consideration why you choose to use this effect. So there is no right or wrong aperture to use when you do landscape photography. There's more talk of an optimal aperture relative to the scene, the lens, and the focal length that you are photographing. So I do occasionally get asked whether or not I'm afraid of shooting at f/16, and the answer is no. I am not afraid of shooting at f/16 because if I was, I would not do it. It all depends on the combination of the lens, the scene I'm standing in front of, and what I want to have in focus. I don't mind compromising a little bit on sharpness if it means that I can take everything in one exposure or reduce the amount of focus stacking photos I need to take. After all, I can add a little bit of sharpness in post-processing, and nobody in the entire world can see the difference unless they pixel peep and know my raw files, and you don't. If you want to learn more about how to get sharp photos, check out this video, and if you want to learn how to focus your photos, check out this video. If you want to learn more about composition or post-processing, be sure to check out the links down in the description of my video for my ebooks on composition and my post-processing course. And obviously be sure to apply the coupon code to save a little bit of money when doing so. If you enjoyed this video, I would highly appreciate a like, and if you want to learn even more, check out my other videos and subscribe.